Good morning, afternoon and evening, and welcome to the 2021 Annual Keynote of the Herbert Smith Freehills China International Business and Economic Law, or CIBEL, Centre. I am Professor Andrew Lynch, Dean of UNSW Law and Justice, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event today. I would like to begin today, as is in important practice in Australia, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. And the UNSW campus is situated on Vegegal land, lands which were never ceded. I pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Vegegal people, and I'd extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are also in the audience today. This is the fourth annual CIBEL Keynote lecture, the first two having been held in 2017 and 2018 in Beijing, and the third in 2019 in Sydney. It's wonderful to resume the series. International business and economic law has become an integral element of globalisation. It provides the fundamental framework for regulating cross-border activities ranging from trade, investment and finance to treaty negotiations, rulemaking and dispute resolution. In 2015, the CIBEL initiative was established as a long-term UNSW strategic initiative. In 2018, CIBEL became a centre and is the largest academic centre in this field of international business and economic law outside of China. It currently has 10 academic members covering a wide range of legal research, teaching and engagement, which includes fintech, trade, investment, competition, corporations and securities, commercial arbitration and alternative dispute resolution, and intellectual property. CIBEL has premier partners across the world, including Tsinghua University, Singapore Management University, and Shanghai Jiao Tong University, just to name a few. The most recent collaboration was the second annual conference last Wednesday through the Tsinghua UNSW Centre for Chinese International Economic Law, jointly run by CIBEL and Tsinghua Law School. The strong partnerships with overseas institutions brought together academic colleagues, regulators and industry partners from different countries and enabled fruitful discussions through the joint events hosted by CIBEL this year. These discussions have informed and encouraged public debate and will help shape the future of the international economic law order. These achievements would not have been possible without the generous support of Herbert Smith Freehills. CIBEL and more broadly UNSW Law and Justice greatly value the key industry partnership with HSF, which involves collaborations on events, teaching in the form of guest lectures, overseas electives in China, and other career-enhancing opportunities for students of the UNSW Law and Justice faculty. And now to today's main event. The format today is for our keynote speaker to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we have two excellent commentators placed to add their thoughts to the keynote. And then we will move to question and answer from you in the audience. So please use the Q&A function that is on the sidebar of this Teams channel. We are really delighted to welcome as our 2021 keynote speaker, Ms. Natasha Blycha. Natasha is currently the Managing Director of the law firm Stirling Rose and is a Director and Founder of the Digital Law Association, and she also sits on the Australian Law Council's Digital Commerce Committee. Natasha has previously led, until just last month, Herbert Smith Freehills' Global Digital Law Group with team members all around the world. She specialises in smart legal contract advisory and creation and distributed ledger technology. Natasha advises on regulation and governance of digital assets, platforms and applications, digital ethics, and human rights policies. She has lived and worked in the United States, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. We're really delighted Natasha is able to join us today, and we thank her so much for this contribution. And she's going to begin her presentation with a short video, a taster on metaverse. Thank you.
Look over here.
It's magical when two people see the same hologram. It's the original idea for why we created HoloLens. A year ago in Barcelona, you were there to create the first ever shared holographic experience. 200 or so people wearing HoloLenses and seeing holograms all around. As you know, COVID took place, Mobile World Congress was the first to cancel. Now at Ignite, because of COVID, it's not a physical show. We have instead people teleporting in. The entire show is being hosted on Microsoft Mesh, which ushers in this new era of collaborative computing for people to represent self across experiences in a consistent way. The entire keynote is done in mixed reality. Manta rays on stage and fish in front of you. The audience will start contributing their own ideas into this holographic scene as a group that has never been done before. We'll talk about Microsoft Azure, which is why Microsoft Mesh is built on top of, that enables this whole show to take place.
Search area locked.
We'll go through several examples of how mixed reality is changing the face of business. The partnership with OceanX, a ship that is now going to have a holographic lab. Scientists on the boat will be wearing HoloLenses to see what's going on underwater in submarines, to connect with scientists on shore that now will be able to teleport in for the science expeditions that they're working on. A key benefit of mixed reality has always been the ability to represent self across both space and time. I can walk a manufacturing facility with someone even if I'm not there. I can be in an operating room with someone even if I'm not there, so that we can have the same physical feeling of presence, where you can represent yourself from an avatar all the way to a holoportation and collaborate as if you were there.
Thanks so much. Well, hopefully that taster was not too proprietary to make you all feel a little ill. But what it is intended to do is to spark our imaginations as we go into this keynote, which is asking the question, who is holding the baby on digital assets? And the reason the metaverse is relevant to digital assets, because that is the realm or the evolutionary component of the digital realm that is the nexus to where we hold our digital assets. So perhaps it's quite useful at this moment to actually break tradition with Simon Sinek and not start with why, but start with where, and do that at the same time as we think about acknowledging the traditional owners where I come from. And the Noongar people are the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet. And then you can ask the question, well, where do we meet? Because we do meet, from my purposes, we're meeting from Noongar land. And then you can also say we are meeting in everybody's land. Well, where are we? We are everywhere, and yet we are nowhere. And we're also meeting in the digital realm. So we're starting with where. And something that struck me when I listened to that Microsoft Metaverse advertising was this concept of our ability to represent ourselves across space and time. And that's something that I'd like to do as we move through this presentation, is to keep these fundamental questions in our mind, is around who are we? How do we identify? Who is responsible? Where are we? And what rules should apply inside the digital realm? And should they just be a mirror to the realm that we currently live in, the analog world? So if you could just turn the slide over for me, please. So this is a bit of an overview about what we're going to talk about, but I've got a lot of topics on there, so it might be a bit of a canter through some of them. And I tip my hat to our very esteemed guests who will speak after me and say probably far more clever and authoritative things that I'll say in this presentation. One of the things that has happened in the last 10 years is we are increasingly spending time in the digital realm. And that, of course, is something that has increased significantly again over COVID and our stay at home, stay safe, stay at home period. And in fact, we are now spending 40% of our waking time online. And as you can see from that clip, we're currently doing that in quite a two-dimensional way, but we are increasingly going to move from doing that in a two-dimensional way into a three-dimensional way inside the metaverse. And I want you to feel a little bit of discomfort when I use the word metaverse, because anybody who's cool or woke will, because they'll think, my God, stop using that word that someone's tricked you into using. Actually, the metaverse doesn't belong to one company, and it may be that it's a word that disappears over time, but it could well be that it's a word like internet. That is an agnostic word that will apply to lots of different virtual spaces that coordinate as different jurisdictions, the same way that we see countries change names and coordinate as different jurisdictions. So now, just to keep Simon Sinek happy, I'm going to move to the why. And when I think about, and Wayne, if you could flick slides for me, please. Whenever I have something in my neural wiring that whenever I think of converging technologies, I start to think about that scene in 2019. It made my stomach churn when I saw the long line of people summiting Mount Everest. Does anyone know the image that I'm talking about? And it had 50 people who were on the top of the cliff waiting their turn to do this incredibly difficult and complicated thing. And somehow that always makes me think about how we as humans try to develop our technology, and we're constantly in this race to breach new frontiers. And when we do that, I suppose we walk on the shoulders of giants. We move with the technology that's come behind us. And sometimes we have these great big explosions of new technologies because they are actually a combination of super technologies that, when blended, allow us to do even more complex things. And some would say that we've really reached that point. We've come out of an AI winter, if you will, and we're reaching a point where we are seeing significant shifts in blending technologies. And this slide is a little bit daggy. It's probably not the most impressive group of all the names around technologies that we've got going, but I'm going to just dive a little bit into some of these words and add a few more to the slide. So to this slide, I want to actually talk about blockchain for a second. And oftentimes you don't know who you're presenting to, so you could be working from somebody. If you're a very sophisticated blockchain expert, I apologise. If you're somebody who just wish someone would explain blockchain to you simply, I'll give it a crack. In this instance, a blockchain I like to think of as three different things combined. That is, it's not a central authority. It's not held by one person. It's held by multiple people. It's also like DNA, insofar as your DNA is a curation and collection of all the previous generations of people who've come before you. The same thing with the blockchain. It carries a historical record or ledger of all the previous transactions that have come before the transactions in the latest set of DNA or block in the blockchain. And the last thing is around a consensus protocol, and that is how the distributed group, or not one person, but lots of people in concert, decide that the information that should be added to the latest block of the blockchain is accurate. And that's, I call the digital high five. It's a consensus protocol. Now, those three things can manifest in all number of different ways. There are public permissionless blockchains, there are private permissioned blockchains. So I like to say a blockchain is not a blockchain is not a blockchain. But for our purposes, blockchain is quite important because it is actually, in terms of public permissionless blockchains, a lot of the place where the most critical digital assets at this point, and the trillions of dollars that are being spent on DeFi and crypto assets and crypto tokens are taking place within, for example, the Ethereum blockchain. And that's quite relevant because you look at energy storage, and some of the public permissionless blockchains obviously have significant ethical questions around sustainability as they have high carbon usage. So one of the things that, again, we're coming off the side of blockchain is smart legal contracts. So to those who are lawyers in the room, or anybody who deals with a contract, i.e. everybody, we know that the next generation of contracts, or the digitised version of contracts, will be a critical digital asset. And that means that there is a significant need for the plumbing that supports or underpins contracts of the future to meet some really key public indicia requirements, that you have the ability to access contracts, you have the ability to have portability of your contracts. There's a whole host of new requirements around cybersecurity of your legal contracts that the blockchain, if used as plumbing, may be the best way for us moving forward to a decentralised plumbing system rather than a centralised system to support the digitisation of the legal sector. So sitting in all of this, another thing is data, and data is the mother's milk of AI, and we have some machine learning experts certainly sitting here who know more than I do. But what has happened in the last few years is we are exponentially collecting data in all our key industries and sectors, and this, coupled with cybersecurity, is having an enormous impact, and also coupled with very significant new advances in some of our generative algorithms like GTP3, mean that we are actually approaching a frontier where, similar to what we're seeing here, a combination of artificial augmented reality and virtual reality, we're seeing a partnering of the who in what we do, where we don't generate content or own property or do anything just by ourselves. We may do that holding hands with somebody else. And that somebody else can be code or a computer or an algorithm or a machine, however you'd like to talk about that. So going back to those, then we have, so the who is pretty important in this question, because the question of the entire keynote is who's holding the baby on digital assets. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the second half of the presentation, because it really strikes to the heart of the legal questions around digital assets and the platforms that support them. And that is because traditionally the law looks for somebody to hold custody. That is to be the person who looks after proprietary interests, who is the person who is responsible if something goes wrong. An example of that might be in a traditional banking system. If you lose your wallet, you're quite happy to then go and ask your bank to give you stop your card or protect your money. But when you move to a decentralized system, you may not have those protections, and you yourself are the who, together with code, who may be responsible for your assets. So there's a big change in the who that is coming when you move to digital assets. But perhaps even more astonishingly than that, there's a big change in the who for who we are. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the legal section of the presentation. But one of the most profound and interesting components of moving into the digital realm is a question around digital identity. So there very recently has been work done by the Digital Transformation Agency, where we're having submissions about really, really important questions that not necessarily everybody is paying attention to, which is to ask, how do you identify yourself? Should you be in control of your digital identity? Should someone else be in control of your digital identity? Should the state be able to tell you who you are? And should the state only collect fields of data around you that may actually have nothing to do with your cultural manifestation of how you like to say who you are? For example, an Indigenous person might like to refer to themselves in a way that is reflective of their community and their family lineage, but there isn't a field necessarily sitting in a digital identity form that allows them to do that. So who's holding the baby? Well, there's some other really interesting technologies, again, looking at this slide, that make me think that we need to be a little more expansive when we think about what's coming with the metaverse and actually what's already been. There's a wonderful book I read recently by C.F. Black, and I'll attempt, if someone can attempt to get it in the chat, it's quite interesting. So she is an Indigenous scholar, who has spoken about the land as the source of the law. So this is really interesting because it's applying a technological lens in a historical fashion. So it's a way of perhaps not saying that technology is an evolution, it's saying that it's already been sitting there. And it's quite a paradigm shift for those people who come through a Western methodology, for example. But it would say that the actual law itself is sitting in a quantum type field inside the actual land itself. Again, that becomes a really interesting frame of mind for us to look at when we're doing, going through this question ourselves and saying, the law as it sits in the analog world, is that the same law that should apply equally inside the digital realm? So let's ground that out a little bit. Do you wish in that world that's just been shown to you, your imagination can take you all the places that you're going to be able to go in the future as you present as, I think it was called, your holographic self at this point, with no arms and a little bit of hands and a little bit of face, but no legs. Do you want somebody to be able to lock you in a room on a platform without your permission? Or do you want somebody to be able to strip you naked, strip your avatar naked in a business meeting? And they sound a little bit of a foolish question, but they're actually quite serious questions, because interestingly, I have personally found time spent in the metaverse is actually quite unnerving, and it can be a place where you can feel feelings of fear, and it can feel quite real. One of my earliest experiences being in actual virtual gaming was to have a whale and a school of fish pass by my face. I've got 4 children, and we were at a children's birthday party, and I actually I'm sure my face felt the tickling of the school of fish in the aquarium we were swimming in pass by my face. So all of that begs the question, what is real? And that actually has been the plague of digital assets in respect of the law. And those of you who are familiar with some of these base digital assets like cryptocurrencies, for example, know that the law didn't trigger. It didn't trigger early because we said these things aren't real. So you shouldn't have legal rights, and you're not really getting hurt, and you're not really unsafe. So let me pause there for a moment, and I'm going to put to you a straw man of some digital legal rights. So this is being put together by the Digital Law Association, and it's something that went to the Digital Transformation Agency, but it's an illustrative draft of a digital Bill of Rights. So this is extrapolating from what are your basic human rights, if you will, or constitutional rights, and saying which of these might apply in the digital realm. So the first one, right to other rights, and we can probably stick this in the chat as well. So this is what we've put together, that all Australians, regardless of their physical location, have the right to the same fundamental legal rights in the digital medium as those afforded to them in the analogue environment. So, for example, protection of acquisition of property on unjust terms, the right to vote, freedom of movement, religion, expression, political issues, freedom from discrimination. Do you want your avatar to have the ability, or is that you? Are you your avatar? Do you want that avatar to have the same rights inside the digital realm as you have in the real world? And I would suggest to you that the answer is yes. And the really interesting one is property. And property is probably the most exciting part of the digital realm. Catalyst for lots of people who enter in is because it's an amazing way to make money. Because it's just like we go into new jurisdictions and we put up our flag and we say we own this thing. One of the things that has characterised a lot of legal work inside the digital realm is when we try to sell bits of land Has anybody here tried to purchase land in the metaverse or in games? Or perhaps you've tried to purchase a piece of digital art or a non-fungible token or these other digital assets. Or perhaps you've just spent 2 weeks playing to earn and building a garden in Fortnite. What we know from the courts is that actually there is the ability to have digital assets as property. So we start to create that nexus where we say digital assets are real and the digital environment is real and property laws apply. But they don't, if we can just switch over to the next slide, please. Oh, that's it. But we're asking very substantive questions around how they should apply, because keeping in mind most laws work on this single custody issue, that if I get in trouble or if somebody takes something from me, or if I want to possess something, that I should be able to actually identify that person and or that proprietary event. Second, potential digital right to disconnection. All Australians, regardless of physical location, have the right to be identified and interact with the government in an analogue way. Do you have the right to only fill in a COVID form on a piece of paper? Do you want the ability in 2 years from now to be able to only interact online? Or do you think it's acceptable that or important that we always have the right to interact with our state in a paper form or an analogue form? I'm going to canter through the rest. The right to digital access. Do you think that people need to have the right to the internet itself, or the right to all these new technologies? And that's something that's also been spoken about at length recently with the infrastructure bill in the US, where we're seeing a merging of access to essential infrastructures combined with bridges and roads and those traditional analogue things. Right to digital identity. Now this is core, as we said before, is who are you? Do you have the right to say who you are? And who gets to keep control of that? And there's really very betwixt and between discussions going on now all over the world, with Europe leading, where we're talking about privacy enhancing technologies and sovereign systems and packetizing of people's identity, where they have rights over saying who they are. Of course, that's quite difficult because people are very fickle about actually looking after their rights. And I think I said I have 4 children, and I know that sometimes data and rights get given up for a Big Mac at times. So, but we do like, in theory, we like the idea of maintaining control of our digital identity. Right to data. All Australians, regardless of physical location, have the right to access, curate and control their personal data. So this includes the right to erasure. That's a stretch in Australia. So in Australia at the moment, we are actually, we have a bill that is talking about moving our APPs, our Australian privacy principles, to be closer to what's happening with GDPR in Europe. But in Australia, we don't have an overarching right to control our data or a right to erasure if there's something we don't like in respect of data that's being held about us. Now, the last one is around right to distinct analogue personhood. And this is the one where I think we're probably approaching science fiction, but maybe we're not. And that is, do you have the right to exist in a purely digital sense? Do you think it's a good thing to only exist in the metaverse, or to only exist for the state's purposes in an analogue way, or is it okay to be across both? I think the majority of us will be across both, but the way this has been put forward is all Australians, regardless of physical location, have the right to define their thoughts and actions as separate from their data footprint. So the reason that becomes important is because when you travel through the metaverse, when you travel through an online platform, you leave evidence of where you've been. But sometimes what your evidence is, you've clicked over a code, you've left a trace. That doesn't actually mean it was you in the real world that did those things. And there's often a lag time between data that happens in the online world and what's happening in the real world. Particularly, say, for example, if a crime was committed in position X, you might find that there's only a sensor that picks it up 4 hours later from a different location. So there shouldn't be an assumption always that what is the online presence or your data footprint is identical to what is happening on the in the real world. Okay, so that is some of the big ticket items, but I want to just talk a couple of different legal issues before I close off, because I only have 3 minutes left and I could talk all day and night and underwater about digital assets because I think they're so exciting, is robotics. So this is interesting because this is where we take the heart and soul of the digital and potentially the consciousness, and we bring it back down into the physical realm. So this is where we might say there's a tethering, and this idea of what is the law in the digital realm, again, must be connected and tethered to what's happening in the real world. Because if we create robotics, and it's often said that anyone who tries to define robotics is an idiot because it's not something that's easily defined, that you actually will put inside the belly of robotics is algorithms, and it is code, and it is machine, which may be hosted on the cloud and may have cybersecurity issues and privacy issues. But as sure as anything, it has ethical issues. And these are things that will come back, and I know that the people coming after me could spend a whole host of time talking about those ethical issues. But what we do know, and this is again coming from practice, is where there's no law in a lot of these areas because they're nascent, emerging, and the law is centralised and it hasn't caught up, is we tend to rely on ethics as a way of trying to guess or trying to preempt the way the law is going to meet the requirements of this new technologies. And ethics is a useful remit for being able to guess what that is. And of course, ethics is, you know, in order to be a good digital lawyer, we found that you probably should have a really good understanding of religion. You probably should have a good understanding of different philosophers. It wasn't enough, and also different cultures. It's not enough to be a good digital lawyer to have just a good understanding of the law. The last thing I want to talk about in my final minutes on robotics is I want to talk about sex, and that's because that's an exciting way to leave, but that's because of a big thing about the WHO on digital assets and identity is about relationships, and relationships are important on digital assets all the way through from smart legal contracts, which are trying to put a ring around business relationships, all the way through to artificial intimacy. And I'm going to shout out to Toby, who is in quoted in Rob Brooks's book on artificial intimacy, is that robotics themselves are part of how we try to define who we are and who we have relationships with in the future. And I leave with you that in your future, there's a Venn diagram where you may have relationships, intimate or otherwise, romantic or otherwise, with a virtual, it may be your virtual presence and your virtual identity with another virtual identity, or it could be with a robot which is increasingly neuroplastic based on increases in DNA harvesting and data that we know about increasingly what humans are like, so we can replicate. So all of those things are quite interesting, and I'm going to leave it there for our distinguished other panelists to say far more clever things about who is holding the baby on digital assets.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was really fantastic. I know that we've got an audience all around the world who are in different time zones. But as someone who is at the sort of the end of a day, which has been really a bit narrow, a bit focused, and even mundane, that's just been such a delight to listen to. And, you know, the imagery that you painted throughout your talk, which would sort of spark off various thoughts, but also the challenges and the future possibilities. This is such an exciting area, and you made it so accessible to those of us who don't work in it, while also putting the hard questions out there for those who have already been thinking about it a lot. And it's wonderful now to turn to two of those people for their reactions and contributions in addition to what you've said, before we then throw open to all of you who are online joining us. Thank you through the Q&A. So thank you, Natasha. And now I'm going to turn to our first commentator today, who is Professor Toby Walsh. Toby is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and Scientia Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the UNSW School of Computer Science and Engineering and CSIRO Data 61. And he's also an adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology. Toby's a strong advocate for limits to ensure AI is used to improve our lives and has spoken on this topic at the UN, to heads of state, parliamentary bodies, company boards, and many other entities. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science and was named on the International Who's Who in AI list of influencers. He's authored 2 books on AI for a general audience, the most recent of which was entitled 2062, The World That AI Made. Thanks very much for joining us, Toby, and we really look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, Natasha's so much to agree with, so little to disagree with, but so many interesting ideas to try and pick up and take on. And I'll begin at the end. I think artificial intimacy is the real AI to be both excited and worried about, and I'll come to why we might be worried about it at the end of my comments. But if there has been any silver lining to the pandemic, and I acknowledge the great hardship and that all of us been through for the last 2 years, it has that we've discovered that these digital tools that we already have can connect us, can keep us connected. And there is the prospect of moving from the 2-dimensional to the 3-dimensional, much more immersive, augmented use of those tools in the future. That's a future that is beckoning us and whose possibilities we can now start to see. So it's a really interesting moment in time, a moment where we can see our institutions, our society changing around us. It's going to be, I'm sure, a period of great change. Natasha asked who the metaverse belongs to, or who it will belong to. Well, it belongs to Neil Stephenson. He's the author of Snow Crash, which introduced the word metaverse. And I will remind everyone that that novel is a dystopia. It's where computer viruses can crash human brains. And so we shouldn't forget that there are fine possibilities that beckon to us, but equally the technologies can be used in other ways that may not make our lives better. And we must imagine a future to build that future. And I think it's really important role that the humanities and art and literature have to help us imagine the futures, so that people like myself can go off and try and help us build those futures. Natasha also asked a couple of who questions. I've got, I think, the 2 most vital who questions to ask, which is who decides, and to point out that in the past it's been too often white male people like myself in rooms in Silicon Valley who've been deciding. And then the other who question, who's going to profit? And certainly one thing that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years has been that the rich have been getting much richer, and inequality within our society has been increasing. And that's not sustainable. And surely that's another small silver lining of the pandemic, is that we've realized that we can pay people to stay at home. We can actually afford things that were thought unaffordable in the past. To go back to the first question, who decides? I think it's also very clear now, after the last 10 or 20 years of innovation in the digital space, that we haven't been regulating the digital space adequately. I think there was a period, and it was acceptable perhaps a decade ago, where people thought you can't. It was somehow, the digital space was somehow different to the physical space, and it is. It does have its own unique characteristics, which I'll come to. So you couldn't regulate it like the physical world, and that you shouldn't. That would stifle innovation, and perhaps that was true 10 years ago. We've had some remarkable innovation that has provided those tools that kept us working through the pandemic, that has increased prosperity, has grown our economies. But I think now there is a real realization and acceptance that you can, that rules apply to the digital space just as much as to the physical space. And indeed, we should actually probably just take some existing physical rules and apply them more forcefully to the digital space. We don't necessarily need lots of new regulation. We can just apply existing rules. But we've avoided applying, even though that we could perhaps apply them, and that we should. That in fact, we're going to see innovation stifled, that we'll see data monopolies occurring, we'll see uncompetitive behaviours emerging if we're not careful. And we've certainly seen examples like with GDPR, where regulation has been brought in, and despite the naysayers, has shown to be remarkably effective in giving people various privacies. And we're seeing that conversation now shift to technologies like AI, which I welcome. And certainly, even my friends who work in some of these big tech companies that are going to be the brunt of much of this regulation will tell you in private that they would welcome some regulation here, that it's a race to the bottom and they would like some flaws to be put onto the behaviours. And we don't want to continue some of the neoliberal excesses that we've seen in the last couple of decades. That markets certainly have brought great efficiencies and generated great wealth, but equally, markets all still need rules, and those rules are human constructs that we get to decide. Even old-fashioned rules need to be applied. We certainly haven't applied antitrust, I think, sufficiently well in the digital space. Is it particularly in our interest that, I'm always bemused that friends log out of Facebook because they can't put up with its worst behaviors anymore, and log back into Instagram, not realizing that they haven't actually left, and that there's still, is it in the consumer's interest that Facebook was allowed to buy WhatsApp and to buy Instagram? I don't think it is. And clearly we see that now with the race to own the metaverse. And I'm fearful that it will end up a walled garden and it won't be a common good. We've seen this, we've seen this so many times in the physical world, in the old-fashioned non-digital world. I mean, take any big sector of the economy, take banking or pharmaceuticals or oil or any of those. We were very careful to make sure that there was adequate competition. And as those businesses evolved, for example, we look at banking, and banking became more digital. We were very careful to make sure that we put in regulations like open banking to ensure that competition stayed in place. And yet there's no competition for social media. You are locked into Facebook's walled garden, and so we've really missed out in suitable regulation to ensure that we get competitive behaviours. Natasha mentioned the increasing importance, which I agree with, of our digital identity. As more of our lives move online, more of our time is spent online, it's going to be more and more important that our identity there is something that we worry about. I'm old enough to remember the early internet before the web, where you could be anyone. You could be a dog. You could be, no one knew who you were. And I think part of the uniqueness, part of the beauty of the place was that you could reinvent yourself. You weren't connected to the prejudices people had about your physical self. And so I think we should be careful that we don't lose that. And just to end with just some final observations, that digital assets are somehow different to older physical assets. The copies can be created at almost no cost. They are not physical, they are not visible in many respects, they're immutable, you can make infinite copies at almost no cost. And that does change the nature of property and property rights. I mean, we have to think carefully about that. And then the final comment I want to make, and I want to come back to artificial intimacy with this comment, is that the thing that worries me most is the way that humans can be hacked, and how in the digital space that's so much easier. And a fundamental right, the fundamental right that I think we aren't protecting enough, is our right to autonomy, and not to be subliminally or explicitly coerced into behaviors that aren't in our own best interests. And unfortunately, technologies like AI and machine learning are driving that, our ability to micro-target people. And that fundamentally will disrupt our very core democratic processes if we're not careful. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Toby. I love that we bookended between artificial intimacy was really, a rapid fire of brilliantly stimulating property law questions for the next generation, and a lot more besides. That was really fantastic, and I look forward, I suppose, to the audience responding to that, please, in the Q&A. You'll see there's quite a few questions there already, and one of the ways that would help me as a moderator, and that is an important priority in these proceedings, is if you like the questions that are there, then I can make sure I prioritise those to put them to the panel. So that would be good. So please add some new ones based on the many that Toby put before us as well. But we don't stop there, don't draw a line under it, because I'm now going to our second commentator, who is my colleague, Professor Lyria Bennett-Moses. Lyria is the director of the Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation, and a professor at UNSW Law and Justice. She's also the co-lead of the Law and Policy theme in the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre, and faculty lead in the UNSW Institute for Cybersecurity. Lyria's research explores issues around the relationship between technology and law, obviously, including the types of legal issues that arise as technology changes and how these issues are addressed in Australia and other jurisdictions, and the problems of treating technology as an object of regulation. Recently, she's been working on legal and policy issues associated with the use of AI, the appropriate legal framework for enhancing cyber security, and oversight for law enforcement intelligence. She's also a professor of the Australian Academy of Law. Lyria, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Natasha and Toby, for starting this off. I think it's a great conversation. So I wanted to, maybe this is going to jump around a little bit, but I wanted to, I suppose, respond to a few thoughts with some counterpoints. So the first is thinking about what the change is as we move into, whether we call it the metaverse or something else. Because it's not true to say that law can somehow only deal with a physical world. In fact, even where law is dealing with a physical world, it's often not dealing with it in ways that directly represent the physical. So to give a really good example of that lawyers at least might relate to, is if you think about something like a fee simple. So in Australia, we don't own land. We don't actually own the physical land as such. What we own is a fee simple, which is a kind of hypothesized version of owning land, which was originally comes from sort of the whole doctrine of tenure and feudalism and all of that, and I won't go into the history of it. But just to highlight it as an example that law isn't only about the physical. So what's new is not necessarily a kind of loss of physicality, but something else. The next point I wanted to respond to was this idea about having the same rights in the digital world that you have in the real world. And that can be interpreted in different ways, some of which I agree with and some of which I wouldn't. So if we're simply saying that you have human rights independent of whether you are interacting with the physical world or whether you are interacting online, I would agree. But I think the idea that the rights should always be the same or the law should be the same in both contexts would push that, for example, too far. So we can compare, the idea of physical assault with assaulting an avatar. Now, it might be that assaulting an avatar is distressing, but it's probably not the same thing as a physical assault. Taking it to even further extremes, if I hacked into some online platform and deleted somebody's online avatar character, identity, what have you, then clearly that might be a crime and I could be prosecuted under various cybercrime statutes. But we would expect a lower penalty for that than actual murdering a human being, right? So they're not exactly the same thing. Another context in which this online-offline type comparison can arise, and one I did some research on previously, was this idea that when the government was saying at the time, and it was at the time of the internet filter, which was a terrible idea, but what the government was saying as a justification for that is if something's not permitted offline, we shouldn't be able to find it online either. Now, that actually, it can happen. You could do it, right? So I know that if I go into a movie theater, I'm not going to accidentally stumble across pornography, right? That's fine. I go into a movie theater and everything's rated and no X-rated, stuff in movie cinemas, at least in Sydney. And so, that's fine. And we can absolutely police that and do that. If I wanted to have the same effect online, I would need something like a giant firewall around the country with very strongly enforced rules and a small army of content moderators. And I would inevitably cause problems for freedom of speech and other things through that whole apparatus I would need to create. In other words, when we're comparing what we get online and offline, we also need to consider what the costs of achieving the same outcome are. So we could achieve the same outcome online as we can achieve in a movie cinema, but it would be far more costly, both financially and in terms of other rights we might value. So it's not always the case that the two ought to mirror each other in the way that the law operates with respect to each. But I want to go to the earlier point, the sort of the technological bubble slide, if that makes sense, that everyone remembers, right, with all the different words. And this is coming to the point of regulation, but I'm going to get there. So the first thing I want to note is that we sometimes assume when we see these technological words in bubbles or in debates, AI, digital assets, cryptocurrencies and so forth, that those words, and by looking deeply at those words and by regulating the things that those words describe, is the best way to think about the legal issues raised by those bubbles. Right. So what is my concern with that? Well, my concern is that the terms, if you look at any of them, and I'll pick a couple just to illustrate, cover many different activities, entities, relationships, and their intersections with law are diverse, and the problems they raise are diverse, and potentially the solutions required are diverse. So if you think about AI, just as an example, one of the things that people often raise as a concern with AI is that data-driven inferencing can cause hidden discrimination that's not necessarily intended, because what you're doing is capturing earlier data, which is based on historical biases, and then you're sort of iterating that into the future. And we end up with things like Amazon hiring algorithms that deliberately exclude female applicants because they were trying to duplicate the existing department. So data-driven inferencing in that sense can be a problem, and it can be a problem in the way it interfaces with laws like discrimination laws and how those laws were formulated around the idea of a human with a kind of animus against whether it's women, people of a particular racial group and so forth. And so we might want to think about what law needs to do to, if you like, keep up with the new ways in which decisions are made in order to provide similar protections to that which we would look to discrimination law to provide. But that's a very different problem from the one that was raised by, for example, robo-debt. When people were concerned about robo-debt, it wasn't really data-driven inferencing. It was actually, except in the matching. It was mostly, and most of the errors occurred in the context of a poorly written program that didn't mirror the way the law was meant to work. The result was erroneous debt letters. And here's where the problem, or the AI, if you want to call it that problem, comes in, is that those debt letters, we didn't have the regime in place to ensure contestability and accountability that meant that erroneous government decisions could be easily corrected, or at least not at the same rate as the erroneous decisions were being made. So those are very different problems. Now we can look at AI and we can say, well, how should we regulate AI? But I would put it that in fact those two problems relate to very different things, both of which might be captured by a term like AI. One is really about data-driven inferencing, at which point I don't mind if it's a machine learning algorithm doing it or whether it's some old-fashioned statistical method that is doing it. We've got the problem either way. And the other one relates to automation. And in fact, when I rose we had a big government event that was, it had some fancy name, I'll try to remember it, tech something anyway, I can't remember. It was a big fancy event in Canberra. And they had... Technopoly. Sorry? Technopoly. No, it wasn't Technopoly. It was Tectonic. Tectonic, that was it. And it was this big government event, and they were launching these AI principles, and we're now going to have wonderful, accountable, et cetera, AI. And I asked, because the minister was there, and it was all very important people were there, well, what about robo-debt? And their answer was, oh, that's not AI. Right? And they're probably right. It's probably not. But it comes back to the point about, are those bubble words the things we want to really be regulating, or do we need to think more deeply and in a more fine-grained way about what our response should be? Now, I can make a similar point about digital assets. There's lots of different things that we mean when we talk about digital assets, and they raise quite distinct legal issues. The New South Wales Law Reform Commission, for example, started with the idea of looking at digital assets, but ended up saying actually there's two separate things going on here. One is digital records, things like when someone dies, can the next of kin access a social media account? And it suggested a bunch of law reform around that. And the other is digital assets in the sense that there is some kind of property and it is simply in a digital form, so that the property, the asset, is digital. And that might be because there's intellectual property in a digital photograph, for example. We might also be able to propertize some kinds of secrets through sort of saying, okay, if you've got a trade secret and you have sort of obligations of confidence, then they match with a shows in action, right? That is your right to enforce the secrecy in that context. We also have personal information, which is privacy law. So when we use a word like digital assets, we're actually covering a whole range of things, and the law might need reform, and indeed the New South Wales Law Reform Commission came up with some suggestions in that regard, but it's not the term digital assets that's the right term to work out what those might be. So the final point I want to make, if there's still time, I don't know if I have a minute left. Do I have a minute left? Okay, is where does ethics fit into all of this, and where does regulation fit into all of this? My concern about ethics is the way it gets used, and in particular the way it gets used by corporations and by government. So if you look at the Australian government's AI ethics principles, you'll see one, just quoting one as an example, AI systems should benefit individual, society and the environment. Well, that's great. It's motherhood and apple pie, sure. But why shouldn't everything? Why only AI systems? Why not corporations should, or government should, or mines should? If we're thinking about COP26, on the one hand, AI systems have to benefit the environment, but somehow not necessarily anything else. So in other words, ethics is fine, but we have to work out what the target is and really ask the question, are we only worried about ethics in the context of technologies like AI, or is there a deeper need to think about ethics and to think about ethical categories beyond that? And it's the same point with regulation. We absolutely do want decisions made about the future. We want to help design the metaverse, if you like, not Silicon Valley, but the democratic polity in Australia, and through international law, nation states coming together. But we still need to recognise that that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing we want to regulate is the technology. Sometimes it is. And I think Toby's persuaded me through his various talks and writings that autonomous weapon systems could be in that category. In other words, we want to prohibit, we would love to prohibit war. Perhaps that might be an overachievement. It's probably not going to happen, but perhaps we can limit autonomous weapon systems, which raise very particular ethical issues in the context of military action. But most things, that's not necessarily the right target. Competition law that Toby raised is technology neutral, right? And a lot of really good regulation is. What we want to make sure is that the good regulations apply to the technological context, sometimes just by getting regulators to act, and sometimes by working out how those laws need to change to better respond to the issues that are raised, but at a more fine-grained level. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyria. That really rounded out a fantastic trio of presentations, starting with Natasha's keynote. I think I've looked through the questions and I'm trying to find a really good way into this because they raise so many different issues. So I'm going to start with, I think, a fairly straightforward question, but I think a really important one. And I will go back to Natasha for this question. The person has asked, how might, they haven't said all, but I'm going to say, how might all this impact on traditional legal advocacy? What should legal advocates do to stay on top of this technology? Oh, Natasha, you're muted, as they say in the classics. Can you please unmute Natasha?
Oh, you see, the answer for Natasha is that you've got to stay on top of the technology.
There we go. Nice filler, Toby. Yeah.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Hello. No, I lost my tools. So I would say that, I mean, just somehow to connect what Lyria has just said to that answer is there is definitely not a one-to-one ability to use existing laws in respect of digital assets as there is general property or general assets. And the primary reason for that is the same thing we say about data, is that you can't capture a cloud, is that digital assets evolve over time and they change. So that makes them very difficult to moderate. And it really comes back to this quick key question around who's holding the baby, is that digital assets, you often don't have anybody who's paying particular attention to them. In fact, it segues into this idea of distributed autonomous organisations, which to our question asker, I would say, if you want to know about what's coming, pay attention to distributed autonomous organisations, because that's when the person holding the baby is not in fact a human or a corporation, it is actually code. And because so many of our legal arrangements require somebody to be responsible, we haven't actually got a very good system now, legally or otherwise, that allows us to hold code responsible and also be able to determine the integrity of code that is making decisions about who or what should own what, when and where. And that is the actual true genesis of the who's holding the baby question. So if you want to be up to date on all of these things, I would suggest that a love of reading is a pretty good start. And also definitely some really important ones that I pay attention to is I pay attention to what MIS is doing, pay attention to what FATFA is coming out with on AML CTF, that's pretty useful. And then if you just, I think a good point Lyria is making is that you don't regulate on a technology, you don't regulate on an industry because it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. But to say things are technology neutral may not be 100% true going forward, because some of the technologies themselves, as we said about digital assets, they have these unique indicia that are absolutely new because they are alive.
Thanks, Natasha. And your answer prompts me actually to go to Toby, because of something he said earlier in terms of the importance of to understand this enormous period of change and all its potential. We need to read broadly, and we need to look to literature and as many different sources as possible. Toby, what would you recommend for people's reading lists? And that includes for lawyers' reading lists in terms of how they can start to get their heads around all of this.
Well, people tell me my books on AI, which are written for a general audience, are accessible, so you might want to look at those. But no, I more generally, I think we don't respect enough the humanities and the role the humanities have in these debates. And sure, I can tell you the potentiality, the limitations and the opportunities that some of these technologies bring, but equally many of these questions are not technological questions. They're questions about what sort of society. They're questions that historians should be helping us answer, philosophers, anthropologists, and legal scholars about well then if that's the end goal, how do you ensure you get to that end goal? And they're not questions about technology.
Great. Yes, that's brilliant advice, and certainly start with Toby's books and then keep going. And Lyria, I'm going to ask the next question to you. It is a highly favoured question from the audience, but it also ties back into ethics. So I think I'll start with you, and then of course Natasha and Toby, please jump on if you would like. The question is this one, Lyria. Firstly, I say thanks so much for the really fantastic talk. I've really liked it, really enjoyed it. The Senate committee released a final report last month and recommended that Australia conduct a policy review of a retail e-Australian dollar. What do you think of the possible retail e-Australian dollars implications for lawyers and businesses, including from the perspective of data, example, digital identity and ethics? Thanks again. Yep.
I might actually ask Natasha if you have any views on that one. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in there. God, where to start? So some of the Senate recommendations are quite far-reaching. The ones, just segueing back to the distributed autonomous organisations, that's a pretty big deal, because what you've actually got is the government saying that they're open to the concept of having not a normal corporate structure, not just a partnership. You're actually having a structure that is moderated by code, so a legal entity moderated by code. That's a massive new, yeah, I'm still blown away that that's in one of the recommendations. It's very exciting. In fact, the historical note on that is I believe it's Wyoming is the other state that has introduced DAOs, and they were actually the state that first introduced the corporate legal structure. So there's a really nice early adopter methodology there. But then some of the other Senate recommendations around let's talk about central bank digital currencies. They're probably one of the most important digital assets that there are, and they really could displace traditional the traditional banking system, or the traditional banking system. As you can see, CBA's recently made its announcement that they're going to be selling cryptocurrencies, or serving cryptocurrencies rather, through their platform. I understand that's still in pilot phase. I don't think normal consumers will be able to do that till 2022. But central bank digital currencies, particularly retail central bank digital currencies, you have to ask the question around where does money get to when it's programmable? So there's a fascinating potentiality there that the government itself, through the central bank, is able to either hold accounts. You as an individual hold a bank account with the central bank, not just with a commercial bank. And also there's some really good arguments for why that should happen. And one of them is that the central bank itself has the legislative remit to keep control of the money supply and to keep a stable economy. And we do have a central bank that is no longer able to, fiat currency is basically disappearing, and the old rhythms of monetary policy no longer exist in the way we think they do. Honestly, or anyone who did an economics degree like I did 20 years ago, it's not the same way that monetary supply works, monetary policy. So something has to change. And once you move to programmable money, that is an ability even to say, okay, you've got welfare of $1. I'm actually going to look at your social credit score, for example. Maybe not, let's say, and I'm going to diminish or put a penalty into that $1, or only allow you to spend that $1 here. You don't even pay tax. I put the tax immediately on the dollar. But this is all about putting contracting or programming and making your money living. So there's lots of design questions around that, but that is something certainly that the Senate is pushing, and these are the best. I heard Dr. Will Bateman say, ANU scholar, saying, why isn't everybody talking about central bank digital currencies? I think it's really exciting. And another, if you want to be a thought leader, go and understand everything about central bank digital currencies.
Thanks, Natasha. Did anybody else want to come in on that question?
Yeah, I'll make an observation, which is a historical observation, which is, if we go back and look at how we benefited from the first industrial revolution, it wasn't just the steam engines and the electricity. It was because we invented new institutions like public limited companies, and we did change quite radically how we drove our economy. We got rid of the gold standard. We introduced the welfare system. And I think in 100 years' time, when historians look back at this transformation in the nature of work and the nature of a society, it won't be just the technologies that they remember. It will be the distributed corporations, the use of the blockchain for contracts, smart contracts, and for changing how the money supply is governed. That will be the things that facilitated the economic growth and prosperity that the next 50 years hopefully give to us.
I agree with that.
Great. I'm going to turn now just to another fairly short question, which I think is really just a combination of two of the posts, which is to ask whether whether it's true that the fundamental question is whether to give the online presence a legal personality. Is this necessary for owning digital assets and online property? Is that the answer, to create a legal personality for our second life, as it were? Natasha, do you want to have a first go at that?
I want to have a go, but I'm going to leave it to my esteemed panelists. But I want to say this, it should just blow your sci-fi mind, because you're asking a question which is basically like a multiverse question, because if you've got one digital identity and you start to nominate yourself as that digital identity, well, what's to stop you having multiple digital identities? So I just think that where does it stop? That's why when we got to, on the Digital Law Association, this Strawman Digital Bill of Rights, which we hope the that the Australian Human Rights Commission, they've got some good work that they're starting on, that is to actually say, do we need to tether? You have to, it's not identical, and Lyria's made a very good point. These are not identical things. Your digital presence is not identical to your on-the-ground presence, but they need to be tethered. You need to have a reference point back to your analog identity. I think you start to float in the ether when you just have a digital identity.
Thanks, Natasha. Lyria, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, and this is a really good question, right? But okay, maybe if I just pick up on what Natasha said first, this idea of tethering. I think there are contexts in which tethering is really important, that you don't want to have sort of free-floating digital personas, but there are also contexts in which you might not want to tether. So, for example, do we want to say, for example, that everyone's, think of something like Twitter or some sort of, chat forum or whatever you like, whatever social media you use, do you want to say that that necessarily has to be tethered to a real world identity? Or do we want to allow for the possibility? Like I tell my students, for example, if you want to email me anonymously, like you have some feedback that you don't feel comfortable giving as you, set up a Gmail account, give it some crazy name and email me. And that way, you can give me feedback and I benefit from the feedback, but, you can be confident that I'm never going to hold that feedback against you. Not that I would anyway, of course, but psychologically that's the difference. But I think that's actually a good thing that we can do that we can actually communicate sometimes without tethering things to our own real world identity. The issue comes up, I think, and, in particular the idea of legal personality. If you did it, you'd have to do it for a particular reason, and you'd have to think about what that was, and it might require more than legal personality. So in other words, if, for example, the concern you had in some particular online context in the metaverse somewhere was that people might be doing things online in a way that's not tethered and in a way that harms other people, simply creating legal personality might not be enough unless you did something like we do with cars and say you have to get insurance, and so there's some extra. Simply having a legal personality doesn't mean it has assets, and so it can be sued, and so it can actually be made responsible for things. So maybe you want to set up something like that. But I suppose my question is, for what purpose and in what context? And if we're going there, then is legal personality going to be the right solution in that context? And it might be that we think of circumstances in which we really do want to create that, and which that might, like corporations, lead to a blossoming of a whole new way of thinking and being and having an economy work or whatever. But I do think we need to ask the question rather than sort of at a high broad level, but at a far more specific level.
Can I just make a 2-second comment on that? Is that also you don't want to get those in the digital realm. Cybersecurity is a major issue. So you can break contracts in a new and beautiful ways. You can break identity differently when it's a digital identity, and cybersecurity is and a lack of cybersecurity is a way that I can hack your digital identity in a way I can't hack your analog self without ending up in a whole bunch of different criminal issues. But I just say that is another reason that we need to be very careful about this full identification inside the digital realm.
Thanks both very much for that. I want to stick with this idea of tethering, which I find pretty fascinating, and also to connect to where Natasha started us off, which was this question of where. One of the questions that has been posted in the chat is, I think it begins as a very practical one, and it would be great to answer that practical question, but then perhaps see where it takes you. The question is this: how do you enforce a judgment when the digital/AI operations traverse many countries and the contract makes no mention of jurisdiction or forum? Even in the questioner's mind, the Hague Convention is of little assistance, it seems, to her or him. So this idea of tethering and location.
Yeah. Should I have a crack? I don't want to.
Yes, I think Natasha, we'll start with you.
There's some really practical answers. So when you are actually doing tech production, there are practical things that tether you or keep you to an analog. Even if you've got a global platform that's servicing lots of countries, you do end up with different privacy law requirements, for example, jurisdiction per jurisdiction. And in the design of your platform, you end up, for example, blocking certain jurisdictions where you don't meet different requirements. So never think of a global piece of technology that's actually a well-operated piece of technology from legal perspective to be acting jurisdictionless. That's just not accurate when it comes to the law. You are operating in law, then you're operating within the law that you are serving people, and GDPR is really good at that. Sometimes you have the law operating extraterritorially because it's saying you're serving my citizens, even though you're coming from another country. One of the ways that people deal with that, and sometimes for government services, they say, I only want the servers, even the actual physical infrastructure, I only want it to be on the land, in the place, in the country of the place where that critical information or secure, important information is held. So there are things that happen from a legal perspective to ensure that you stay in jurisdiction, and jurisdiction by jurisdiction legal applies. I don't know if someone else wants to jump in there.
Yeah, and Natasha's very right. I mean, the cloud actually is physically based in giant servers that live in physical places. But also I think it's worth looking at where regulation has been most effective. And we're not getting much agreement at the international level within fora, whether they be the World Economic Forum or the G20 group or anything like that. The consensus that we're going to get, the sorts of agreement, is going to be minimal protections for the consumer. We're seeing very effective regulation done by bodies like either the European Parliament or national governments. Look at what happened after Christchurch. We enacted powers here that that were then copied. I mean, it's interesting to see how viral regulation is, both written in a viral way so that it does.
So true.
It does spread beyond its own borders, but equally it's viral in a mimetic way, in the sense that we produce that regulation here and then it's copied. Why was it that Facebook vigorously defended the news, the change in paying for news here? Was because they could see that was going to set a meme that was going to set the standard for other countries. And sure enough, there was a similar bargaining agreement happened shortly afterwards in France and now various other countries where they're having to pay to support the news there. And so we will see probably the most effective regulation done by national governments, which then spreads. And so it's actually, I think there's a bit of a race on at the moment amongst governments to set the standards by being innovative on what they regulate today.
It's also the digital dispute resolution rules. I'm not certain that I 100% agree with them, but those have come about from the UK as a result of smart contracting and digital assets happening on public permissionless blockchains, where they're actually saying you don't have sight, you don't have jurisdiction built into these smart contracts because they're effectively automated terms, they're not full contracts. So we're going to, on the platforms themselves, nominate jurisdiction and apply to digital assets that a jurisdiction is there to ground a claim, so you do know what you do know what jurisdiction you should have a legal right in, or you're able to have an arbitration in. So that is starting to happen, and people are thinking about those things.
Natasha, I'm reminded of what I understand about laws applied to shipping. That it happens on the high seas, but it always refers back to London, or.
Yep. Yes, there's a lot of work done by the UK Law Commission on these points, and there's some very good legal technical arguments where it gets very tricky. But we won't bore anyone with that now.
Right, but the point is that the digital space may end up like that. It happens in some ephemeral place, but the convention is it applies back to London or wherever.
Yeah, UK Law Commission Digital Assets Review, very legal and good to look at. And there's the Routledge textbook on financial markets. That's also a really good read for understanding a bit more about that.
Thank you. That's, I think, in some of those answers, we really got close to where I think some of the other questions are expressing an interest, which is around lawmaking and its effectiveness. And there's two questions here. They're not the same, so at the risk of overcomplicating things, I want to ask them both to you and just see which bits excite you and you go with. So one is a comment kind of question. The minister that introduced, I think Toby's just dropped out for the moment, but he might be back. So Natasha and Lyria, this is all on you. The minister that introduced / oversaw the introduction of Robodebt is the same minister introducing Australia's digital identity legislation, and the timeline shows the legislation is being rushed through after only 1 month of consultation on the draft legislation. Comments from the panel on how a proper process can be implemented here, and my own editorial comment around that as someone who worked in the field of national security law is that rushed legislation can often be a bit of a phenomenon. So that's the first question. But at the same time, someone else has made this, Daryl has made this comment. The issue to me is that law reform is typically reactionary in the sense that regulators, lawmakers, or the general public often only realise the dangers of matters after it's become more prevalent and perhaps far too late. Surveillance capitalism is one. Can regulation ever really rein in technology and their implementation? So thanks to both of you for those questions, because they provide, you know, it's really interesting because one says legislation is often rushed and understanding is quite low and therefore we can get some poor results. And then Daryl's comment is to repeat that often a real truism that law follows technology and invention. So I'd be really fascinated to hear responses on this, and I'll go to Lyria first. Thanks.
Okay, really great questions, and I like, Andrew, how you played them against each other. So the first question is really, you know, about what is a good process for, you know, for government, for example, to employ. And I think it is really about, you know, processes of consultation and Andrew, as you know, as public lawyer, in fact, I'm sure you'd be able to answer that question as to what that can look like. I know with the digital identity legislation, just by way of example, is they were quite open to having consultations, and we indeed organised one sort of a policy roundtable with the DTA around digital identity, and they were open to hearing critical views, different perspectives, and building that into their process. Obviously, rushed timing, not everyone got to do that, and maybe not everyone interested in it had a chance to think about it, hear about it, and respond. But certainly from a process perspective, I think that kind of openness to dialogue with different kinds of organisations and a conversation, hearing feedback is really important. And you know, I mean, we could critique different processes, which is better, which is worse. Ideally, lots of time, lots of consultations, and diversity within those consultations. A really good example of that actually is the data sharing legislation. The Data Availability and Transparency Bill, which went through a multi-year process, including specific consultation with Indigenous communities and in different cities around Australia and in rural areas and so forth. And it took a long time to put together. You can like or not like what they created, but as a consultation process, perhaps that's a really good practice. In terms of the timing of these things, the sort of idea of how does law manage this? I mean, this is literally my entire academic career, so it would take me, therefore, a similarly long time to answer that question. But just in a nutshell, I do think we need to think about this from a process perspective. There are all sorts of different methodologies that have better and worse aspects to them. In Australia, we rely on law reform as a primary mechanism, which involves bodies of lawyers coming together with, you know, a sort of overview of technology chapter and then an extended legal analysis for the rest of the 20, 30, 40 chapters. In Europe, they go much more with technology assessment, which is actually often technology post-PhD coming in to look at policy from the perspective of deep technology expertise and thinking about it that way, with, you know, most of the chapters being all about the technological possibilities, and then a chapter at the end going, oh, and therefore we need better privacy law, full stop, right? So can we bring these things together, and can we create better structures for timely and thoughtful responses? That doesn't necessarily mean getting ahead. We don't need a legal system to deal with flying cars from Back to the Future just yet. It means keeping it up to date, but through a good institutional process and mechanism for doing so.
Thanks, Lyria. You know, technology is a wonderful thing. because it can be unpredictable. And for a moment there, we lost both Toby and Natasha. And Lyria is such a pro; she kept delivering on that answer. And by the time she'd finished, everyone was back. Toby, welcome back. We've missed you for the last few minutes. Natasha was fleetingly gone. The question that I had asked was around lawmaking, and Natasha, you did hear the question. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that. I know you didn't hear Lyria's answer.
I would just say I actually agree. I think this is so critical that they're probably, you don't want to, I don't know if we're at a point, based on what I'm reading, I don't know if we're at a point where we can close that out yet. And the other one is just around self-sovereign identity. It's too important, like the current methodology doesn't really allow for self-sovereign identity. And, you know, if you look at some of the biggest thinkers like Tim Berners-Lee, there is work that they're doing with Inrupt and other, I mean, there's other proprietary solutions, but their self-sovereign identity is not something to knock off the list just because we don't draft in a way that allows for that to be a way of moving forward.
Thanks very much. So we are getting very close to time now, and I'm sorry we won't be able to answer all of the questions that are on the chat list, but because I'm so glad to have all three speakers back, I would love to go with one that gives them a chance all to say something as a sign out. And Anonymous at 554 has lobbed a perfect question for that purpose. Can you reflect on the future trend of digital assets? There are many issues, but what's the major issue that deserves special attention in the future? So if we can go around, and Toby, I'd love to go to you first on this because we haven't heard from you for a while.
Sure. I certainly think probably the most interesting idea of the last 20 years is the blockchain. And there is, it's one of those things where you look at it and you think, oh, there's going to be so much blood on the floor, just like there was with the .com boom and bust. And then in 20 years time, then we will actually see the true value. And I suspect that's the same cycle that we have to go through with the blockchain. It's a beautiful idea that will allow us to innovate and cut out rent seeking, cut out the middleman. And yet, you know that we're going to go through a very painful period where there's a lot of snake oil and a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. But we will get to a good endpoint.
Okay, thanks very much, Toby. I'll go next to Lyria for your pick for future trend of digital assets.
I'm going to stay away from the technology trends because I don't know. But I will say that I think one thing is getting from the legal side. I think it'll be deconstructing that idea, but then also going back to the broadest category of all, just the idea of data, right? Without it having any special features, without knowing that it's a token, that it represents a token and a blockchain over here or anything else, and just thinking about how do we want that managed legally? Is it okay to keep the current position, which is basically that unless you're in a special category, the law pretty much has nothing to say. Do we want to think about data sharing and how those kinds of things work? Do we want to recognise something, whether it is property or something else, some sort of sui generis interest that people might have in data? And I'm not just talking about personal data here, I'm talking about data that people take time to collect. We've had this debate in different guises over time, from database rights back when people called it databases, but I still think that it's very much an open question about how the law manages the broadest of all the categories of digital assets.
Okay, and lastly, and I hope Lyria left you some room there, Natasha. What
we're going to be
say?
Cheeky and try to get two in one. And one is it's kind of coming off Lyria's point. It's about relationships, and it's that when you have digital assets that are multi-owned, that's really gets complicated, and we need new laws. And the primary example of that is the digitised version of the legal contract. That is, contracts are owned by multiple parties. When you digitise them, you're bringing a whole bunch of new rules and risks into contracting. And the bigger issue around that is, as lawyers particularly, we need to be asking substantive questions, and we're not. The legal industry is not yet Most senior lawyers in everything from judiciary, bar, you name it, law firms, whatever, most people haven't actually got close enough to the technology to understand the natural justice issues that are at risk when we start to digitise our primary products. And I would implore everyone on this call to start thumping the table and say that we need to protect the digitisation of the law, and not just leave it to VC funding and not just leave it to proprietary solutions. It's the law.
Well, what final note to finish on. Thank you, Natasha. I really want to thank all three of our panellists today. I thank my colleagues at UNSW, Toby and Lyria, for their wonderful comments and great answers to the questions that the audience has asked today. But I obviously really want to extend a particular thank you to Natasha Blycha for delivering the 2021 CIBEL Keynote Annual Lecture. Natasha, thank you so much for your time. Natasha is the Managing Director at Stirling Rose, as I said at the beginning, and it was just so wonderful to have your thoughts on this broad topic of digital assets. There's been a lot of reflection on history, literature, the future, all that it holds. It's been an incredibly rich discussion due to all three of you. I also want to thank all the audience for your great questions and for stimulating such a wonderful discussion. And I also want to acknowledge again the support of CIBEL that is provided by Herbert Smith Freehills, our great friends in the profession. No matter what the time of day, wherever you are, I hope the rest of your morning, afternoon or evening is enjoyable. Thank you so much for joining us. See you at the 2022 annual lecture.